Chris Symposium from ICS Wayfinders, and we apologize to everyone who's watching for coming on live 10 minutes late. It is the usual technical challenges that got us a little bit behind. I am Gideon Strauss. I'm an Associate Professor of Worldview Studies at the Institute for Christian Studies, and I'm delighted to be joining this conversation today from Stellenbosch in South Africa. Our guests include Greg Veltman, David Dark, and Rob Joustra. They will each introduce themselves at somewhat greater length in a moment, but David Dark is the author of Everyday Apocalypse, The Sacred Revealed in Radiohead, The Simpsons, and Other Pop Culture Icons. And Rob Joustra is one of the co-authors of How to Survive the Apocalypse, Zombies, Cylons, Faith and Politics at the End of the World. And obviously from these two titles, you can see why we invited these particular guests to join us to talk about pop culture and the apocalypse. So maybe starting with Greg, going on to David, and concluding with Rob, how about you introduce yourselves to all of us?
It's morning in Calgary. That's where I am. So good morning. I'm Greg Veltman, and I'm currently a doctoral student studying higher education. But I've always been I always think of my field of study as being very much pop culture as the broad definition of field of study, and then how that relates to different things. So my passion is engaging with university students around issues of popular culture, and so that's my interest in this conversation in pop culture and apocalypse and how we find our way through that. So.
Well, I'm David Dark, and I am coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. And most of my life I've been a high school English teacher, but I recently went back to school and got a doctorate in essentially religion and culture. And I too conceive popular culture very broadly as that which has been cultivated popularly, and I'm really glad to be a part of this conversation.
Well, I'm Rob Joustra, and very glad to be here. I teach politics and international studies at Redeemer University College, which is just outside of Toronto in Canada. Slight break, but it's not morning here; it's afternoon. And my interest, I teach politics, and I teach international relations in particular, and so the apocalyptic has always been fascinating to me, not only from an academic point of view, but also as somebody who just loves binge watching an awful lot of trashy television and literature. So I've loved getting into that and digging into it, especially with Alyssa, who's the sort of better half of the co-authorship for the book that's coming out later this month. And of course, she teaches in New York, and she's sorry she couldn't be here, but undoubtedly she gets around so much and writes so much. You won't miss having a chance to hear what she has to think about things.
So David, tell us a little bit about Everyday Apocalypse. What is the book about?
Okay, well, came out in 2002, and it was an attempt, among other things, to overcome the, I want to say, the wicked theology, the dysfunction, the madness of the best-selling Left Behind series. And I loved The Simpsons, I loved The Matrix, Truman Show, Radiohead, all of those wonderful pop culture artifacts, and I had stumbled on, through reading New Testament scholarship, William Stringfellow, Walter Wink, people like that, and N.T. Wright in a big way helped me to see apocalypse as revelation, as that which cracks the pavement of the status quo, as that which lifts up the value of human existence, politics, culture, rather than degrading it as merely temporary or or that which degrades the earth itself as a disposable ladder by which we climb to heaven. So I was trying to conceive apocalypse as a much more everyday occurrence, apocalyptic as that which makes us more aware of the importance of our own lives and the lives of others, against the best-selling account of apocalypse that was happening with Left Behind. It seemed to me that a number of Bible readers were in danger of viewing their faith as primarily a sort of hell insurance, life after death consolation. And the book, well, I'll note with the book that often when people realized I was writing about The Simpsons, they would say, I mean, not everybody, but a few readers said, "Oh, this is good. You're using The Simpsons to tell people about Jesus. I approve of that." And I was tempted. I'm always looking for the approval of others, so I was tempted to play along. But I had to say, no, I just think The Simpsons is good, and Radiohead is good, and I'm lifting up these liturgies, these stories, as creative offerings that make us more aware of ourselves and what's important, that kind of thing. And Apocalypse for the book was this banner under which I was able to bring the way of affirmation. It's also, an awful lot of it is trying to configure the book of Revelation as a life-affirming text, while nevertheless having deep criticism for that which passes for realism and the everyday dysfunction of our geopolitics, that kind of thing. Is that enough to get us going?
I think it is. How about your book, Rob?
So the book that Alyssa and I did, it sort of partly came out of just an awful lot of fun that Alyssa and I had, and I hope if you read it, you'll kind of get a sense of how much fun we had putting this book together and some of the big questions that we had that were driving us. So probably the fundamental, the sort of research question, if you will, you can still see I'm still recovering from the methodologies class in my doctorate. The sort of, the research question was, how did we get so quickly, within a generation in our popular imaginations from the kind of dominant trope, which was, kind of the Shire to, sort of the purging of innocence in Westeros. And we've noticed that, it wasn't just the apocalyptic, and I'll talk about that in just a second, but it was the kind of, it was the sort of dystopian turn in popular culture that really fascinated us. And that we wanted to talk about, including, what are we asking? Why do we keep sort of, manifesting these things over and over again? What are the kinds of problems that people are trying to wrestle out in this pop culture? And I'll mention it because Alyssa insisted I go see it before we launch the book next week in New York. I mean, the latest Batman versus Superman, which has just been panned, and I just saw it last night, and what a slugfest. It's full of this kind of thing. When I walked out of that movie, I thought, Batman versus Superman does for justice what Machiavelli's The Prince does for virtue, right? By the time you reach the end of it, you think, oh, there's really no meaning to the thing, and it's just kind of, whatever we decide it's for, which is a pretty unsettling place to land, I think. So that was our research question, and because at the time I was working on a PhD in international relations, where I was, using Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. As a priest friend of mine said, if you would have chosen a shorter book, you'd probably have done the PhD faster, and I think that's probably true. Because we were reading that at the time, I said, you know what, like Taylor talks about not just a secular age, but these sort of the malaise of the modern moral order. This is the way he puts it. But essentially, some of the sort of sicknesses that are sort of unique to our sort of moment in time. It's not to say it's all sickness. It's not to be fatalistic or sort of down about it, but but some of these problems have particularly modern character, and he lists those actually both in his little book, The Blaze of Modernity, and then in whatever way he managed to do this, incorporating that into a new book, A Secular Age, which actually has whole chapters that are just sort of others of his small books. And so the book itself is sort of an attempt to answer what's going on with this sort of dystopian shift, but it's using the popular culture, you know, The Walking Dead, Battlestar Galactica, even some of the less obviously apocalyptic stuff like Her or Scandal, which Alyssa writes on and loves so much. It's using those as sort of a way to narratively demonstrate some of the stuff that Taylor is sort of more sort of densely and philosophically getting after in a secular age. And actually, if you follow the argument of the book, it actually maps out that it's basically a kind of explanation, if you will, of those areas of the secular age, and it follows the order that Taylor himself actually orders it in. So we could have chosen a range of other things. You know, why did we choose, you know, Game of Thrones and not House of Cards and some of this stuff? Some of it is just the decisions we made at the time that we thought these best demonstrated some of the ideas that we're going after. But, you know, even Alyssa and I were talking just yesterday or the day before saying, you know, now if we wrote the book this summer, we might use different examples. And that's okay. We'd still be making a very similar set of arguments because I don't think that we're out of that dystopian term, if I can sort of put it that way. Yeah, that's the summary.
Thank you, Rob. That's great. So I'm going to hand over to my co-host, Greg Veltman, to dig a little bit deeper now that we have, from each of you, David and Rob, a sense of the overview of what you tried to accomplish with your book. So, Greg, you're on.
All right, cool. Yeah, I really liked how both of you talked about the distinction of not just using pop culture, but recognizing that pop culture is part of our reality, right? So because I've heard a lot of the same things especially from Christians who are like, oh, yeah, we need to figure out the lyrics of some artist like The National and figure out, well, how do we get to, you know, Jesus, right? So like every part of pop culture has to then become this like evangelical tool to, you know, figure that out. And so I like how both of you are talking about pop culture as not just this tool that's out there that's sort of like not part of the real world, but is actually part of reality. How do you go about kind of making that sort of argument to people instead of saying pop culture is this tool to use for some other end, but to say how do we actually recognize the reality and the influence of pop culture?
Okay, I'll go first. I think one way I do it is with the word witness. When I think of James Joyce's Witness or Shakespeare's Witness, that's the work. You're looking at the work. You're presuming there's a voice and there's concerns and there's preoccupations and passions when you use a phrase like witness. And one thing that I do as well, and I've probably said this in many contexts, so I hesitate to say it because it can get all motivational speaker-ish, but when I'm trying to get my students to own their own enthusiasms, their own liturgies, their own loves, we go around the room, talk about who we'd like to listen to, who we would most enjoy having a private concert with, and it'll come to me and I'll say that I like Radiohead, and then I say I don't just like Radiohead, I believe Radiohead. I want to receive their witness into my life. If Dorothy Day, when asked, Catholic worker activist Dorothy Day was asked, how do you want to be remembered? And she said, I want to be remembered as someone who read Dostoevsky well, as if being a good reader of Dostoevsky is going to lead you into all kinds of good practices, life commitments. And yeah, so one way I avoid the use theory, as if any culture should be so reduced that we're using it. I go with the word witness and talk about receiving the witness of Spike Jonze's Her, or receiving the witness of a Wes Anderson film. And that usually switches up the expectations a little bit and invites the audience, student, friend, to think harder about their own enthusiasms.
Yeah, I think I really agree with that. I mean, I think part of the way that we tried to get at it is we tried to think of sort of some of the pop culture that we looked at as meeting society in the way that it was already asking the questions it's asking. Taylor talks about our secular age being haunted sometimes, right? The idea in which, there are these deep sort of nestled problems that we don't really have the vocabulary to wrestle with anymore. So we're struggling with it. So because, we're not all learning Latin and theology in high school, and so we don't have some of the same sort of concepts and ways to articulate this, we see Batman and Superman sock it out, right? And that's the sort of liturgical vocabulary of North American culture, I would say, at this point. So we tried to get into those stories and find out, what are the questions they're trying to ask, and what are the answers that they're giving. And that doesn't mean, by the way, that in the book we said, yeah, all the answers they're giving are great. It's, this is all hallelujah territory. Actually, in several instances we said, what, some of the answers they're giving, this is dark stuff. This is deeply dystopian. If we really, if this is what we think at the end of things, the true meaning is, and that's so we differentiate very early on in the book actually between what we call apocalypse and what we call dystopia, right? We do the etymological thing. David has alerted us to that apocalypse and revelation have this common sort of Greek root, and so apocalypse isn't just about wanton destruction. It's about pulling the curtain back. It's about saying at the end of things, what was the true meaning of it? What was the big reveal? What do we see when we pull it all back? And the book of Revelation in the Bible, of course, is very destructive, but it's also fundamentally a book of hope. It's a book that says, look, there's some pretty dark stuff going on. There's some pretty difficult stuff. But when you pull the curtain back, here's the meaning of history. Here's where we're going, right? The holy city and Christ triumphant and all of these different things. And what we've noticed and what we talk about is that the big reveals or the revelations that accompany the apocalyptic narratives, especially sort of post 9/11, are giving increasingly dystopian answers. So the apocalypse is the setting in one case that begs the question, but the dystopia is the quality of the answer to that big reveal. And we categorize some of those dystopian answers as being sort of particular to what Taylor calls the secular age. It doesn't mean we're fatalistic about it. In fact, the way we describe ourselves is being a loyal opposition. There are better and worse answers. There are better and worse ways to realize, what Taylor calls the best of our sort of modern inheritance. But there are also ways to realize the worst of it. And some of these popular cultures play around with and game out in the kind of social scientific meaning of the term what some of those worst ones might be. That can be quite unsettling. It actually doesn't mean that we baptize the thing, but it seems to me very important if we're thinking missionally, if we're thinking as Christians, serving our culture, serving our neighbors, that we answer questions how our neighbors are actually asking.
One of the things that that apocalypse gets me thinking about is the idea of hope. And so, and as you've just said, Rob, like a lot of the answers maybe to our questions are not necessarily very hopeful. And I'm wondering where do either of you see sort of a vision of hope for the future in the way that we answer these fundamental questions?
Well, I see. I kind of have a whole cultural. There's a vision of righteousness at work in the text of Revelation. And I mean, this came up yesterday in a sermon that I was listening to, that the meaning, the breaking of those seals, and the question of who is worthy to break the seal, that will give us what it was all about, what it was all for, what human beings were to have been up to. And when it's not the lion, but it's rather the slaughtered lamb, the lamb who was slain, who is worthy to receive honor, power, glory, praise. I view that image as a call to self-emptying, to suffering servanthood, to radical hospitality. There's a whole ethic at work within the text that then shows up at the end as well. Another theory of culture, when the tree of life is the leaves of the tree of life for the healing of nations, And the water of life is for anyone who thirsts, anyone who even wants it, kind of thing. So I would see what Lewis Hyde refers to as the way of the gift. What Marilyn Robinson's, what's the name of the narrator in Gilead? I can't recall. Jonathan Ames, maybe? He wants his child to be in the way of the gift. So receiving one another and one another's wisdom, one another's stories, lyrics, images, one another's artfulness as a gift is kind of at the heart of what works, in my view, including everything that we sometimes dismissively call pop culture. When we think of binge watching, we sometimes want to say, or I hear people say, that Breaking Bad or Walking Dead or True Detective are guilty pleasures. And I always want to say, why do we do that? There's information in our love of these things, because these series address where we are in a particular way that has us going back to them all the time. So I guess I know I'm kind of rambling now, but the where I see hope is in the sharing of story, in song, in poetry, with one another, in our attempt to say, hey, here's what's helping me, here's what's shedding light for me, here's what's expressing my own anger, rage, and despair better than anything else. Maybe it can help you too. So in that last chapter of Revelation, I see a model for what we have, a way of sharing with one another.
I want to just jump in, Greg, here for a moment, because, David, as I listen to you, one of the things that I'm conscious of is the geekiness of our conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, I mean, when you talked about the seals, you know, I'm thinking Scandinavian film, and but because of the education that I've had, I'm also thinking the Apocalypse of John, and you know, and when you reference Radiohead, I've heard Radiohead, so I'm conscious of the fact that both in terms of pop culture geekiness and in terms of, you know, sort of ancient textual geekiness, the culture we live in is not one in which we necessarily have common languages for any of this stuff. You know, it's not like everybody, well, maybe everybody watched The Simpsons except me, but it's not like everybody watched Battlestar Galactica. It's not like everybody listens to Radiohead. It's certainly not like everybody has some sort of shared understanding or even knowledge of the symbols and references of a book like the Revelation of John. Isn't that already a problem for us to have conversations in these various cultures in which we find ourselves? That so much that helps us to make sense of the world in which we are requires a significant level of geekiness.
Yeah, I think it is a starting point insofar. I've lately been referring to attention collections, the idea that we all have words, images, songs, stories, jokes, anecdotes that help us not want to throw in the towel, that help us get out of bed, that help us look upon one another with hope. And the specificity of Radiohead being that for me is not so go out and listen to Radiohead and then we'll talk. It's rather, here's my mixtape, here's my playlist, here's my reading, here's what's on my shelf, this is what's helped me, please tell me what's helped you, so I can enter into the cultures, the righteous culture that helps you, that aids you in hungering and thirsting after righteousness more, and helps you overcome your own blinders. What has called you out, the way Bob Dylan has called me out. So it's hopefully the start of a conversation rather than sort of shoulding on people. You should like this, you need to watch this series, all of that. But it is absolutely a problem if I'm just bringing my own geekiness and speaking in monologue. I think it was Jacques Ellul who says that monologue ends when dialogue begins. So it's intended as the beginning of a dialogue rather than merely a you should check this out and I'm the only one who knows what should be checked out or something like that.
Yeah, it's. Sorry. Go ahead, Rob.
I was going to say, I mean, I agree, David. I think Gideon's question is a really important one. There are, in a sense, there are different artifacts, there are different stories, there are different narratives, and there are different sort of vocabularies, but they do hinge on a set of common experiences, and I think that's one of the things that Taylor talks about, which is when he talks about, inescapable horizons, and the haunting that we experience. There's some kind of meaning about sitting around, somebody's hospital bed and their deathbed. There's some kind of meaning around this sort of experience. And it may be Radiohead, it may be The Walking Dead, it may be whatever that sort of helps get at those questions for us. But at the end of the day, even sort of, the simple farm boy from Eastern Ontario that I am, I know that these sort of basic aspects of the human condition, regardless of the vocabulary that we manage to find, less or more sophisticated or whatever, is going to start driving us toward those answers. And I think in popular culture, the sort of mass low culture sort of, if I can use that idea of it, this is some of the ways they're being asked. It's not the only way. It may not even be the best way, actually, to be honest. But it is one of the ways, and that's one of the reasons why I think, it behooves us to sort of stand up and speak to it and have a message of hope there too.
This might also bridge us a little bit, but David, you have a more recent book called Life's Too Short to Pretend You're Not Religious, which I've just finished reading last week. And I think that I'm wondering if where we're heading is to try to say, how do we understand the idea of religion? Because it seems to me that if you get too focused on pop culture, you can think that's the thing that you're looking at. And I think what you're trying to say is that pop culture is the narrative or the shape of our religious sensibility, which is more about what Rob's getting at with this idea of the fundamental questions that we ask, right? So we're asking these deep questions about what the meaning of our life is, and yeah, for some people, The Walking Dead is going to speak into that, and for other people, it's not going to speak into that. So I wonder if you want to talk a little bit more about what you mean by sort of religious.
Yeah.
And then maybe Rob can jump in with sort of how they tied that in with the apocalypse and religion, the way they're talking about that.
Yeah, I will, to a degree, skip to the end of that book and say that I start out defining religion as one's controlling story. And I say that there are as many as there are people. And I note that I'm not asking anyone to start calling themselves religious. I just would like to persuade millions of people to stop using the word religion as if it's a problem only other people have, and let the concept describe their own devotions, their own enthusiasms, their own strange ideas about the world and other people, as well as other people's strange ideas. But then I take this word witness again, and I say your religion is your witness, is the shape your love takes. You'll know us by our fruit, as Jesus tells us. Surprise, surprise. What you believe is made most evident by what you do. What you believe, what was the formula? What you believe is what you see, is what you do, is who you are. And to pull it back a little to the pop culture thing, I think we get to level with ourselves by looking harder at our own output and our own consumption in some way, to the idea that, to the resistance we meet when I imply that we're all religious in one way or another. that we all drink the Kool-Aid in one way or another. I like to say, if folks are up for it, show me your receipts, your online footprint, a transcript of everything you've done and said in one day, and from there we will get an indication of what our witness is, what our religion is, and yeah, we'll see how it goes. I feel like with that book, I've taken on the most unpopular argument I possibly could at this point in time, but I think it speaks to when the Pope suggests that if you're more about building walls than building bridges, and Donald Trump responds by saying, I won't have anyone question my religion, not even a religious leader, that seems to be an indication that the heartache surrounding this word, the chaos surrounding this word is worth taking on in one way or another.
Yeah, I think chaos is probably the right word to use. They don't know this. I think everyone on this hangout will have some sense of it. That the term religion, I mean, there's a massive academic industry that sort of just exists for people to kind of have it out on this term. What's the etymology? Where does it come from? Did it even exist prior to the Treaty of Westphalia? Blah blah blah. Is it in and of itself part of the problem because it demarcates some things as being, within this box called religion and other things not? Anyway, I mean, there are wonderful books on this, and David's are among them now, that start to tackle this problem. I do think there are things at stake in this term, and I'd like to use the term myself. Particularly because it's sort of been globalized in an important kind of way. But at the end of the day, I think that the fundamental things that David is talking about, I mean, those are the things that constitute the term that I think that they're the things we want to get at. I don't think we use the term religion a whole lot in our book actually. We use the word apocalypse a lot. We talk about reveals. We talk about good answers and bad answers and how would you categorize those, and so on and so forth. We talk about how people are being driven more toward, if not religious content, at least really mystical, kind of transcendent content, right? Like I mean, Battlestar Galactica is all about this, but even when Gideon asks, you have to be so geeky to have this conversation, and I think, I know, where was this conversation when I was in high school to completely validate how geeky I was? But sadly, that wasn't true then, but it is now. I mean, the nerd stuff, the geek stuff has gone mainstream. And I think part of the reason is, and it's what Taylor says, it's this inescapable horizon thing. We're realizing that at the end of the day, when you've got to give basic answers about life here and values and who we are and what we believe, you get startlingly, surprisingly deep into religious kind of stuff. And I think that's true. And actually, you asked before about notes of hope. And I think that's one of the notes of hope that I would give, that actually the kind of, art breaks down the kind of materialist secularity that's sort of, one of the problems nestled within modernity, that when you get into story and you get into art, there's just no way to kind of live without an acknowledgement of not only the sublime and the beautiful and beatific, and how do you account for that, but also the ugly and the terrible and so forth. And what's the vocabulary, moral, religious, or otherwise, that you do for that? So I think that's part of it.
I just want to ask the three of you, because we got going about 10 minutes late, if it would be okay with you if we kept going for another 15 minutes and finished on the hour rather than 10 minutes before the end of the hour.
I'm great with that.
No problem. No problem.
Yeah.
Then, Greg, maybe if you can keep going for a bit, but I should give you all a heads up, having listened to you now, I would want maybe 5 minutes too for each of the three of you quickly to go through that mixtape. The handful of shows, the handful of songs or bands, the handful of books that if you had to save someone's life by giving them the mixtape, what would be on the mixtape? So we'll get to that, but that's just so that you can think about it a little bit. Greg, back to you.
Yeah. Um, yeah. Well, I'm also trying to be sensitive to so Gideon's sort of steering a lot of this conversation to this idea of wayfinding, and I'm wondering how you connected pop culture to wayfinding. I think it's relatively obvious, but and this might relate back to Gideon's question about sort of what are some of the how do you see pop culture as a mechanism for wayfinding, for people finding their way to some of these fundamental questions about life.
Well, I'll note that it has just always functioned that way for me. Um, I I might have been stuck with some fairly harmful and despairing readings of the Bible in my own. I want to hasten to add that my parents and my church community were exceptional in forming me and discipling me, but nevertheless, and this is probably a common story, I attributed all manner of horrible, horrible things to God's intentions for me as a young teenage reader of Scripture. And one of the things that pulled me out of that was, I'll still have more to say when I get to my playlist, but Rod Serling's Twilight Zone and Star Trek and Steve Martin and Doctor Who, Stephen King, just any manner of thoughtful people who were doing really, really good work, be it via television shows or novels that I found at groceries, Kurt Vonnegut, that kind of thing. And when I took my narrow reading of Scripture and tried to bring it alongside those people, I couldn't do it. And I found them believable and persuasive and hospitable to a troubled mind like my own. Now, there's a way of describing that, which would be I had my religious madness, and then I had all of these secular influences. But I don't think that way of dividing it really does justice to what happened. And even if I wanted to divide it that way, that division dissolves upon contact with the way my heart and mind actually work. I would say I've been surrounded by a great crowd of pop culture artisans my whole life long. And fortunately, I was not constrained by a church community that said, you know, you've got to bring your science fiction to church and decide if it passes muster. Those forces, those people were always functioning on a very deep level, and no one ever convincingly persuaded me that I had to make a choice between my alleged secular loves and my sacred ones.
So, Greg, your question is about wayfinding and how some of the pop culture that we have or thought about and so forth connects to that. Am I understanding that right? Yeah. Okay, so I mean, the first thing that I probably have to say is that some of the pop culture that we cover in the book wouldn't make it onto a greatest hits list for me because the book is specifically about the dystopian term, right? So in some cases, I mean, some of the popular culture that we're talking about, they're not actually giving what I would consider to be good, life-giving, affirming answers, but they are struggling with questions and problems and giving answers that are real answers that people are thinking about, right? So, I mean, the analogy that I've given to some people is they said, well, then, why would you study this? Why would you think about it if it's so dark? And I would say, sometimes for the same reason that, if you were going to understand, if you were going to understand, the 1930s or the 1940s, you might read documents coming out of the Third Reich. Or you might read Mein Kampf. That's not to complain. I think that's a bit strong, but you take the point, right? Like to understand the attitude and the disposition and some of the deep pathologies, sometimes you get into the literature, and I think that's important. So part of the wayfinding is first looking at the questions they're asking. I think all of the shows that we cover and movies we cover do ask incredibly important questions and do game them out in fascinating and important and often artistic ways. And that part of the art, I can celebrate. It doesn't always mean that some of the answers they play with or some of the games that they play are the sorts of things where you say, yeah, that's it. Like, that would give me hope at the end of the day. I mean, I would challenge someone to power through, you know, all 6 books of Game of Thrones and say, this is it, you know, I found hope, you know, there's the light. You know, probably not. But what George R. R. Martin is doing in those books and what happens in the shows is, I would say, powerfully important for understanding our moment in time, particularly questions of theodicy and pain and the problem of evil and of self-interest versus, you know, philanthropy and so on and so forth, or altruism. All of these things are I think, incredibly important. So that's the sort of first point I make about the wayfinding. The second point I've already made, which is that they do open up a more sort of mystical, sort of contemplative space that I think is important. There are other things that open that up too, and so I wouldn't just rest my hat on that. But I think that is important in a sense when the rest of the world, and I can say this as a social scientist who studies this, you know, is resurging with religion. When the rest of the world is increasingly religious, and we in North America still sort of struggle in this kind of secular sort of mindset, here are some of our religious stories actually out front, and in some ways it's part of what may end up being a sort of post-secular cultural turn, and that sort of opens it up as well. But the third point, and I'll try to make this very briefly, but it's very important to me in terms of notes of hope, is that I sometimes say to Alyssa and others, you know, our book does have the kind of footnote underneath it. It's kind of hashtag first world problems, right? You know, because when you look around,
sorry, say that again. Say that again.
Hashtag first world problems for the book, because when you look at, you know, Game of Thrones and the violence, and you know, you're looking at a failed state and all these kinds of things, and you know, we're playing with the pathologies and the darkness that come out of that. Well, look, that's maybe fun and interesting inside of Canada, where Her Majesty's peace is kept. I don't know how you do it in America, but we have a monarch. You know, but look, I mean, I study failed states all over the world. I mean, you know, go find yourself in, you know, the countryside or the rural Somalia, and then all of a sudden some of these big pathological problems that you look at in Game of Thrones don't seem quite so, how should we say, mythical and gamesman-like and so on and so forth. Why is that a note of hope? That's a note of hope in terms of wayfinding, because we have in Canada and the United States, yes, deep problems, yes, deep sicknesses, and we're working these things out, you know, in our popular culture, but we also have an enormous heritage of things that have gone right. We have, you know, a range of gifts that our parents and our parents' parents in these countries have gifted us, and in some ways these pop culture stories are, and this dystopian turn is a warning sign that says, if you go down this path, these are the kinds of places you may end up. So warning, you know, is this what Taylor would call operationalizing the best of the tradition, or is it making possible the worst of it? And I actually think we have a wonderful heritage of some of the best inside North America, and that for me is a real note of hope, actually, quite the opposite of saying, well, it's all going down in a handbasket and so on and so forth. Actually, I take great hope from that and say we can make things a little better. We can work in solidarity with our neighbors. We've done it before. And so that's my sort of third waypoint. It's not actually one that sort of throws up its hands and says, oh, well, let's go into hell. It's actually one of loyal opposition that says, okay, it could go this way, but it could also go this way. Let's work damnably hard to make sure that we realize the best of our culture and the best of ourselves.
There's so much to dig into what all of you have said so far. I'm sitting in South Africa and having conversations with people on a daily basis about the mental concept that in this continent, both Christianity and modernity, and at the same time hearing people's yearnings for both the apocalypse and, in the best sense, and the tiny incremental improvements of the everyday. And so I'm just listening to you, and I'm filtering it through these conversations that I'm having in this country. Greg, do you want to ask one more question and then go to playlists?
I don't have any questions that I'm still itching to ask at this point. But,
Let's go
yeah, if you
straight.
want to move on to the that's fine too.
So David,
Okay. For some reason, the first one that came to mind is Bob Dylan's long poem, Last Thoughts on Woody Guthrie, which you can hear online. You can find it written out as well. And in that, it feels like a nice one with which to start a playlist because Dylan is talking about all of the ways that he had a Woody Guthrie shaped hole in his heart and all the ways that the work of Woody Guthrie fit it in his own attempts to find belonging and to find a voice in which he heard his own voice. Other than that, Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky, for sure. James Parsons' Finite and Infinite Game. David Lynch's Twin Peaks, Mulholland Drive as well. Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly. And the film version of Children of Men, which really just kind of feels like the film of our time in so many ways. I'll throw in too footage of Bree Newsom pulling down the Confederate flag in front of the South Carolina Capitol, reciting scripture while she's doing it, saying, "The Lord is my salvation. Who shall I fear?" Any kind of public liturgy, anything by Daniel Berrigan. Yeah, those are some of the things that I draw on what feels like a daily basis.
Greg, we're going to finish with you, so I hope you have some. But Rob.
Okay. I was thinking about this. Thank you for the advance warning, because I thought, boy, I'm not sure like The Walking Dead or Game of Thrones would make it on my sort of greatest playlist. They make it in my nightmares for sure. I wake up with a cold sweat with these kinds of things. But and the questions they ask are so great. I mean, there are some obscure ones. A Canticle for Leibowitz, which is a deeply apocalyptic book, which is actually the book which is cribbed in the first couple of pages of Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue. He sort of describes this mythical world, and the mythical world he's actually describing, he said, this is more or less just a Canticle for Leibowitz. And that's a kind of apocalyptic story that comes off of the back of the nuclear arms race and so on and so forth. But if I'm going to get to my heart of hearts, like if I'm going to get back down to the roots, the things that I love, I think I've got to say Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Because there in Buffy, I mean, the world that Joss Whedon has made, it's not only whimsical and delightful. There isn't just joy, but there are so many of these virtues that are constantly being thrown into the mix with, many of the deep problems of loneliness and of anxiety and of coming of age and of individualism and authenticity and consequentialism. Do the ends justify the means and this kind of thing. I think it's just brilliant, and I love Buffy the Vampire Slayer. I celebrate the entire canon, and I mean that would be for me one of the ones that I would use. But if someone was asking me that question for them. In a lot of ways, it would depend what their age is, how old they are, what are some of the questions they've been asking, and where they're situated in what part of the world. For students today, I would say the movie Her, for example. I mean, this is I think not so much because of the answers that it gives, although I think those are interesting, but because of the way that it sets up the drama and how it thinks about systems and the logic and the virtues embedded with systems. And how they reflect on us as individuals and the validation that we seek and so on and so forth. I think that movie was really powerful. Sadly, I tried to add it to our core curriculum at Redeemer. I tried really hard and almost got it, but they said it was just too naughty. So I lost that fight.
Greg.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always a hard question for me from people are saying, oh, like what are these core things? Because I would say that most of my pop culture story starts with growing up in sort of a pop culture vacuum. So I didn't have our family didn't have a television until I was, well, maybe in the 8th grade, and so and I think I lived a relatively sheltered existence even for, even though it wasn't exactly crazy to begin with, but so um, so a lot of my pop culture engagement, I think, happened when I was at a time in life when I was thinking about some of these questions. So going off to university and thinking about, like, oh, what's the meaning of life, and some of these deeper questions. And so for me, like the first thing that comes to mind is the films of the Coen brothers, and those are just really good storytelling about asking some of those big questions. And it also took me a long time to actually get to reading the short stories of Flannery O'Connor, but I think that those short stories definitely make the list. And I think those are also helpful because of the fact that you can appeal to the fact that she's a Christian author, but for the most part, people don't think of that as very didactic, CCM or whatever Christian literature doesn't really fall into that category. So, but yeah, I'm always continuing to think about that and getting into new things too. So, but the latest thing that it really intrigues me is this show called The Path, which is like 3 episodes in, I think, which is really interesting about this made-up kind of cult religion that's based in like New Hampshire, and kind of following that story. So anyway, some of the.
Thank you so much to you for participating in our conversation tonight for me. Maybe David and Rob, you can remind us of the titles of your books and make some suggestions of good ways for people to find your books and where to buy them. And Rob, if you have specific events that you want to invite people to, please mention those.
Okay, the two we've discussed, Everyday Apocalypse, and I have a recent one called Life's Too Short to Pretend You're Not Religious. The form of Antichrist called Amazon, you can do it that way, but the dream would be go to some bookstore and order a copy, and maybe thereby get another copy on the shelf of said local bookstore.
That's great.
So the book that Alyssa and I have just done, it's not actually even out yet, so it would be great if you tried to find a copy. If you get one before me, I'll be upset. But it's the launch event is April 18th. That's a Monday at 6:30 at King's in New York City. So that will be the first launch event, but it will also be available directly from Erdman's, I'm told, at the Festival for Faith and Writing this next weekend in Grand Rapids. And it will be available at fine bookstores, including Nameless Online, Denizens, in the month of May. And for Canadians and other people outside of the continental United States of America, we'll all be aware that there's about a 2 or 3 week lag on what's available to Americans. So, but that's the first launch event that we're doing, and that's where you can find it.
That's awesome. So, for those of you who are watching this, we will continue this conversation on Twitter. You can follow our conversation over the next 3 days by looking at the hashtag WayChat, 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 or alternatively looking at ICS Wayfinders on Twitter and seeing the suggestions there. Greg and I will be chatting tomorrow at noon Eastern Time. And we will be joined by David again, I believe, on Wednesday, and then continue our conversation on Thursday, and we might have 1 or 2 surprise guests joining for those conversations. Sadly, no Rob or Alyssa, but we understand that the life of fresh authors is demanding. So thank you all, and please join us for the conversation over the next days.